Well, this is Dr. Stanley Lang, and welcome to this presentation. This is a continuation on the series of videos that I've been doing on whole person health, and this little triangle is meant to give us a mental picture of the idea that physical, emotional, and spiritual health all together create this whole person health experience. So I have a question for you to consider. What do you think is the biggest cause of disease in people in our current more modern societies, societies that are still not living the so-called first world experience? Maybe different answer to that question, but in most of the so-called developed world, United States, Canada, Europe, etc., what do you think is the biggest cause of disease? And the answer is chronic stress. Okay, so chronic stress contributes to and causes more disease than anything else out there, even worse than eating badly, which is pretty bad. So the way that it does that, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I've given a lot of presentations which you can find on chronic stress, but I want to kind of revisit a concept that helps to understand where chronic stress comes from that came up with a patient that I was talking with today. And this is called the reality expectation gap. And so the distance between reality and expectation, that distance, that gap, is the source of my chronic stress. So when the gap is big between what I'm experiencing and what I want to be experiencing, I feel stress. I feel various degrees of unhappiness. And this applies to every area of my life, whether it's personal relationships, especially family relationships, friendships, my work experience, my spiritual life, whatever you do anything in that you have time to develop an expectation for, that little model works to help to understand, why do I feel unhappy about this circumstances? Because over here is my reality, and over here are my expectations, and the gap is pretty big. Now, this is the key to emotional health, and if we understand where the gap is coming from, that helps me to have some sort of a tool to understand how to decrease my stress. Because if I have a big gap in every area of my life, I'm going to be a mighty stressed out person, not to mention an unhappy person. Now, there are multiple different areas, as I said, that this reality expectation gap applies, but there are more than two ways to address this gap. First of all, you can either address the reality, or you can address the expectation to try to narrow the gap. So I can sometimes change my reality, such as simple example being, if my work really stresses me out and what I'm experiencing is way different than what I want, if I quit that job and find a different one, I've changed my reality. And I may still have the same expectation and try to find that in a different job. So that's an example of how I can change reality sometimes. Sometimes I'm stuck in reality. So sometimes I have to go change my expectations. But that's a little bit harder to do, because a lot of our expectations that we have in other people, they're kind of baked in to my mind. I kind of already know what I want, and much of that is already written subconsciously. And so when somebody doesn't match that expectation, I know that immediately the way I'm reacting inside. Now, I still can start to change that by how I think about that person. That's a different story for a different presentation. But the point is that we can also change our expectations in people, and that can dramatically affect how much stress I feel about the circumstance. The third thing, though, that is kind of implied on this is that, and what we talked about today in this patient encounter, is that I can also change what I'm focusing on. Now, what most people focus on is the gap. So once I'm aware that the gap is there, that gap irritates the heck out of me. And so I'm going to focus on that by nature. Well, that gap is occurring in a context. That bigger context is all the other stuff going on in my life. And so the image that I shared is the idea of a stage. And so if you ever have been at a play that has a lot of developed stage material, the background behind the actors, you can either focus on the actors and actresses, or you can focus on all of what's going on the stage. And let's imagine a play where there's maybe 5 or 6 different things going on. You've seen some of these plays or musicals where there's a lot of busyness going on. And if I just focused on one tiny corner of the most insignificant part of the play, and I just looked at say 2 people there, I would miss not only most of the other what was really going on that was important, I would miss the whole background, and that context would be lost from these 2 people that I'm looking at are kind of in the corner of the stage. And that's what we do when we focus on the gap, because the context is the big stage of my life, which primarily is affected by my relationship with God. If I have a relationship with God, then that provides a lot of context and a lot of meaning to everything that's on that stage. If I don't have a relationship with God, I'm kind of stuck with all this other stuff. I don't have any other way to interpret it, but it's still this larger context than this little corner of activity that's going on the stage. In other words, you can also choose to what you focus on. Do I focus on just this gap, this little thing, or do I focus on the big spectrum of my life, where undoubtedly there's some blessings going on, some things you can be thankful for, and you don't have to focus on this little thing. We can choose what we focus on, just as I can choose to turn to the east and watch the sunrise, or I can turn west and not see it. I can choose what I look at and what I focus on in my life. And so I encourage you to take into account that option when you're dealing with chronic stress in your life. And that will help dis-ease to decrease, because that magnification effect that chronic stress has for every disease that's known to man will diminish dramatically. So I hope you found this information helpful, and there are a lot more resources that I have that help to decrease chronic stress if you need some help in doing that. I wish you well. God bless and have a good day.